One of the things that we've often said is that all of the teaching that we've done, many of us, the three of us, Mr. Halligan, Quinn and I, has always really been how to read. That is, we're not so much teaching the Odyssey or the Iliad or Herodotus or tragedies. We're not so much teaching Virgil or Cicero or now the Bible, as we are using these as examples of the more general question of how to read, because after all, we cannot cover the whole of any book anyway. And with the Bible, this is particularly important because it has been so badly read. Just before we turned this machine on, I was remarking that, again, I had been reading Remigius, and in his commentary just on chapter 2 of Genesis, he notices something that I had never noticed before. Now, because I hadn't noticed it doesn't mean that you hadn't, or that millions of other people hadn't, but I've read it over and over again. Certainly those first chapters of Genesis, I must have read them 1,000 times, and yet Remigius noticed something that I had overlooked. It says in there, the Holy Ghost says in there, that the Lord God had not rained upon the earth. That is, he talks about every plant of the field before it sprung up in the earth, and every herb of the ground before it grew, that God had made all these things, but it did not rain. And then he remarks that rain is not mentioned again until the flood. And he then speculates. He spends a few paragraphs speculating on rain. And his, I wouldn't say conclusion, because he doesn't say that we can be certain about this, but because you can never argue entirely from the fact that something is left out, but it certainly is something to be noted. That is, rain is not mentioned. Now that doesn't necessarily follow absolutely that it never rained, but it causes you to speculate that it might not have. Well,
the statement that God had not caused it to rain on the earth is that's what it raises the question in your mind. That it isn't just an absence of any statement about it, but there's a statement.
Kind of positive, negative.
It seems definitely to say that so far he had not caused it to rain.
And I had never thought of that. I always assumed that it rained in paradise, that rain is such a beautiful thing that it must have. I always imagined Adam and Eve in a little hut somewhere with the sound of the soft rain on the roof. And that may be right. I mean, Remigius doesn't say it definitely proves that there was no rain. On the other hand, there it is. The question is raised because the word apparently doesn't occur again until the flood. And then after I said that, you immediately pointed out that, of course, the rainbow was certainly invented by God at the time of the flood. And if there had been no rainbow, well, perhaps there had been no rain. But the point I want to make about this is not so much the fact as how to read. That is a wonderful way to read. The way Remigius reads the book of Genesis, that is, he simply notices everything. He pays close attention to every single word, and stops, puts the book down, and turns it over. Well, it says that it didn't rain. That's something to note. He doesn't just keep on going, but dwells on it. Oh, I'm sure that he didn't come upon that until he had read it 100 times. That's the kind of reading that's kind of discovery that comes only with repeated readings. Or it may be the opposite, very totally naive readings, as a child might notice something like that.
That phrase, that sentence, that God had not caused it to rain, is the kind of sentence that makes a child stop and say, no, does that mean it never rained before? It's a perfectly natural question, but you do need a certain naivete to raise a question like that, because it goes against your assumptions. Really.
Yes, we bring our assumptions to our reading. We bring our training and our habits. It isn't only assumptions; it's our habits, and we are all trained. Us today, in the modern world, we're all trained, whether we like it or not. We're all scientists. We may be pretty bad ones, but we all have that Galilean attitude toward everything. And we want to run on with, whenever we read anything, we bring to it the understanding that we have of the world. And there are two things you can do. You can go back and become a child again and look at it in that naive way, or, and maybe it's just a way of doing that. Maybe the only way we can do that is the second way, that is to read it 100 times and try to, in a way, make ourselves naive. Now that's a contradiction. But if we've lost our childhood, the only way to get it back would be to practice, and that would mean to read and read and reread and reread, maybe with your finger under the words, the way children will read. The little old lady went, and your finger sort of goes across the page and stops on every word. But you might get back into that habit of slow,
reflective.
Is that it? Reflective, yeah.
I think we can pause a little more on that question of how we do read. Mortimer Adler wrote a book called How to Read a Book. And when you talk about how to read, it always reminds you of that book, How to Read a Book. And we admire Mortimer Adler. He was the guy who really kind of invented the idea of the great books, or he's among them, and popularized the idea and taught it all his life. He has continued to do so, and you have to admire him. He is a remarkable man, and very often he's philosophically quite right about things. But that book, How to Read a Book, is not a book that I recommend. It's an ironic thing, of course. It's a funny thing because the naive question that I would expect a child to ask when they look at that book and the title is, well, how can I read this book if I don't already know how to read a book?
It's an old student joke that was made by the sophomores when he first.
I would imagine so, because it turns out that How to Read a Book is a very hard book.
It's not easy.
It's not an easy book to read at all. It isn't a kind of primer the way people might think it is. They think, well, that's kind of a silly thing. How to read a book? That's everybody knows how to do that. But what he does is give you a kind of method of reading. It's really a scientific method of reading the book. He urges you to analyze the text as you go along, and he urges you to extract from the book the most important things. Now, I think for reading a scientific treatise, or for reading especially a modern textbook, that's probably good advice in general. I don't think you want to read every word of a history textbook word for word. It would be paralyzing to do that. You underline things. You say, well, I can see what's important here, or more important and less important, and you underline the important passages and you skip the unimportant passages, that they are things of lesser importance. You read selectively, in other words, and I'm sure that people bring that habit of mind, which really is a modern habit of mind. It comes also from reading the newspapers and magazines, where you get a long article and you say, well, I don't want to read this whole thing. I can see that there are a lot of things in here that are of no importance, and you just kind of skim it or scan it, the way we say. And I think that inevitably people bring that habit to reading anything. It's very hard to convince students that they can't read the Odyssey that way, or they can't read Plato that way. And I think it may be even harder in the case of the Bible, because
that's the thing. The Bible brings this question up in a capital way. All poetry brings the question up, but with the Bible, it's just everything.
Yeah, you have. That is, the idea is, and this is an old statement, that is, all of the church fathers said really from the beginning, that every single word of the Bible is filled with the Holy Spirit. That every word has a meaning and has an importance, and there's nothing there. They use the text. All that is written for our instruction. That's the, I don't know, where does that come from? That's from the New Testament. Isn't it?
St. Paul.
St. Paul, yeah. Everything that is written, and he's talking about the scriptures, it's written for our instruction. And you see, once again, I think our tendency is to say, well, St. Paul was speaking figuratively there. He didn't mean everything. He didn't really mean everything. That's a form of exaggeration. We're inclined to say that because we never mean everything when we say everything. But St. Paul does mean everything when he says everything. It's like when Christ tells Mary Magdalene to go and sin no more. He said, well, he didn't mean no more. He meant you ought to kind of take it easy, not sin so much as you used to. But you say, well, no, Christ didn't talk that way. He talks really in absolutes. And if St. Paul says that everything is written for your instruction, then you have to say, well, that's literally true.
Every word. I had an example of that this morning. Again, I was reading St. Gregory, a passage on a commentary on St. Ezekiel. In the old Roman breviary, I don't know, it could be true in the new one, but in the old one, starting with now, with All Saints' Day, the reading is the prophet Ezekiel, and he is really hard. And so on the All Souls' Day reading, or the All Saints' Day reading, there is a commentary by St. Gregory, and I just turn to it now because in Latin the first word is et. And that's translated here in the Douay version as now. Now Ezekiel begins this way. This is chapter 1, it's the beginning of the prophecy, and it says, now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, when I, etc. Well, what do you suppose St. Gregory done? He says, why does he start with now? Doesn't that imply that something had gone before? That is, and in Latin it's more obvious because the word is et, which we would translate as end. Now every little school child knows that you cannot begin a sentence with end. That's a coordinating conjunction. And Gregory just goes on that way. He says that's a coordinating conjunction in grammar. And there must have been something before. Well, he says it must have to do with prophecy. That is, when the Holy Ghost takes over the prophet, everything that goes before, which is this life, is cut off. So it's perfectly proper for him to say, and, because what he's saying is now, on the other hand.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's how St. Gregory reads. But when you were talking about every word, there it is, just now it came to pass. Now, how many times does that occur in the Bible?
It's a characteristic. You find that over and over again. It's a stylistic habit.
But see, Gregory says, well, there's a reason for that. There's always a reason. Now, the modern scholar scoffs at that kind of reading. They'll say, oh, well, Gregory, what does he know? He was just some sort of naive.
If you were listening to Mr. Senior there in the last few sentences, he said he used now in his own speech over and over again. And he was doing it to make a transition. That is, it does have a rhetorical.
I was unconscious of that.
Right, you're unconscious of it, but it is we do it. Everyone does it all the time. But if you know what you're doing when you talk or when you write, you don't use that loosely. You use it because you are making a transition, and it's important. It isn't. You really you can't leave it out. It's supposed to be there. It's a signal to the reader that something. Now you're going from one thing to another. And one of the things you'll see if you read the fathers in their commentaries on the Bible is that they're very strict grammarians. They're very strict grammarians. They know the grammar perfectly, and they ask questions like that. They ask very elementary questions. They say, "Now, what is the function?
Little school child's question.
What is the function of that word there? I mean, what is it? Its grammatical function." And then they insist upon it. They say you can't read that some other way. That's what tense and mood and form that is in, and you have to read it that way.
Well, last time we were talking about that switch to let us make the world as opposed to let there be.
Yeah.
Let us make a man as opposed to let there be light, or let this happen, let that happen, which is the jussive subjunctive, that is, it's the subjunctive of command, whereas the other one was the concilium or something like that, subjunctive. That is where you take counsel. Oh, gee, that's move.
Yeah.
That's the use of move. I remember it's an old joke, again, I suppose mostly among priests in the old days. They'd say, what's the difference between the Protestant and the Catholic? And that may be one way of leading into it. And the answer would be, well, the only Bible that a priest can quote by heart is in illo tempore. Because almost every gospel begins at that time. Jesus said, at that time, all the gospel readings in the Mass will begin, so that they would remember that. Well, again, St. Gregory or St. Remigius or any of the fathers would stop and say, well, don't overlook that in illo tempore. That's meaningful. And there's not an accidental that gospel readings at the Mass begin with a phrase like that. At that time, he said that there must be something to that. We have to dwell on that phrase. In fact, these little phrases are precisely the ones that we dismiss in skim reading.
We read right over them and pay no attention to them.
We look for the operative phrases and clauses.
Now we're in a hurry, of course. Everyone wants to get through the reading as quickly as they possibly can. And again, that's part of our habit of reading or doing almost anything in our time.
I was just looking at the first three chapters here. The first one begins, in the beginning. The second one begins, so the heavens and the earth were finished. The third one begins, now the serpent. There's now again. Yeah. Now the serpent. That was more subtle. And the fourth chapter begins, and Adam and Eve. Well, there you have coordinating conjunctions all over the place, used at the beginning of chapters. Just the other night, again on the radio, those of you who are listening to these tapes closely must be tired of me saying that, but I'm afraid an awful lot of my evenings are spent listening to that darn thing. I exterminated television, and now I've dropped back to radio. I think I'm going to throw it out, because very late last night, when these dogs woke me up howling, it was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I had to get up and let them out, and they had to stay out about 15 minutes, so I turned the radio on. Well, at 1 o'clock in the morning, do you know what I got? I got someone called Larry King. He's a very famous man today. I've heard of him, but I've never really listened to him.
Show. Yeah. I've heard it somewhere.
He is as bad as you might expect. He is just absolutely unbelievably bad. He has a talk show where people call in. But he had a guest last night whose name is Jerry Falwell, who is a Baptist minister and one of the leading conservative clergymen in the United States, who in some ways has taken some very good positions on some of the moral questions. But Jerry Falwell is a great old-fashioned media man. He knows how to manipulate the media. Well, someone called in and said, how can you, a Baptist minister who believes in the Bible, say that you follow the Genesis theory of creation when there are two different theories presented, one in chapter 1 and the other in chapter 2 of Genesis? Now he says, I'll hang up and let you answer that. Well, Jerry answered that just like that, and he answered correctly. He said, have you got your Bible in front of you? Well, the man had sort of hung up, I think, already, and he couldn't get him. And he said, the second chapter begins so. Now he said, it can't be. The second chapter is grammatically connected with the first. He said, you can't say that there are two different theories. And then he pointed out, which is obvious, that the second chapter begins with a summation, a summary, and then a recapitulation. And there aren't two different stories. It's the same story, but it begins with a recapitulation of what occurred before. That is, chapter 1 goes through all 7 days, and then chapter 2 starts over again. That's essentially what he was saying. But how quickly he was able to to handle that question, and then went on and into debates about it and so forth. I was struck by two things. We had said a moment ago that this habit of analytic reading comes from the modern world. We should never forget that the modern world comes from Protestantism. That is, a great deal of this reading is a Protestant reading. The Protestants take the Bible as a kind of constitution of the faith. That is, as a legal document, which is revelation, and on that book we rest our case. And they read it for the purposes of arguing about everything. When you go back to the Fathers, you don't get that at all. That is, they're not interested in taking things out of context and arguing and debating. If you had said to St. Gregory, there are two theories in the book of Genesis, he would have picked you up immediately on the word theory. He would have said, well, you're not reading it in the right way. But that's not how we read the book. We're not looking for arguments. The Catholic Church is not founded on the Bible. The Bible is taken as revelation, but the revelation comes through the church, and we don't read the thing as if it was a legal document. I started out by saying we don't read it as if it were a scientific text, but the next step would be we don't read it as a legal document either.
Yeah,
which is what Mr. Falwell was about to do. Although he's very good at it.
Yeah,
very good at it.
That question arises because of questions having to do with the text of the Bible. It's very, very sophisticated. But behind it is a lot of very sophisticated argument, which claims that the Bible was really written by different hands, or that different editors had a hand in it, and that the first chapter was written a long time before the second chapter, or vice versa. Frankly, I forget which.
Well, both are. You can make a case.
Yeah, make a case.
They
one
quarrel
is the
with
A
each other.
text, one is the J text, and so forth.
But I mean, those people who read the Bible that way quarrel back and forth. Whatever.
Yeah, and so it becomes an argument, and it really is a way of challenging the authenticity of the text and its reliability. It's an effort to undermine the Bible. The man who called in is one of those sort of amateur skeptics.
He calls scripture scholars.
Yeah. Yeah. Who thinks he can pin down this guy and undermine the position that he holds. That is, that the Bible is reliable and that you can take what it says as being true. So really, in the end, that it's a question really that it's a critical, what we call a critical question. And critical questions have been raised about everything in the Bible. Really, every single thing has been brought under that and subjected to that criticism in an effort, really, to undermine the reliability.
Which is what lawyers do with witnesses. That is, they say, well, this is called a testament. All right, let's treat it as if it was testimony in the court. Now, and they go right at it.
Let's see what we can accept here as being true and what we have to discount as being not true. That's analytical.
Now, when you pick up the Fathers, the attitude toward the Bible is totally different. I think it is. That's a matter of what you bring to the book before you even read it. That is, what are you looking for? Let's go back to the beginning. This is a little conversation on how to read. And we're talking here about how to read the Bible, but it applies to how to read a lot of other things too, especially poetry. But specifically, we're talking about how to read the Bible. Well, Mortimer Adler, in his book, takes the legal position. That is, you treat the text as if it was a legal document, and you try to tear it apart. It's known as critical reading.
Yeah, the text is on trial, really. It's really on trial. And you're the judge. You're the judge and the jury, and you put it on trial. The reader puts it on trial, and the footnotes put it on trial. And and you read it under those conditions all the way through from beginning to end. Whereas when you read a Catholic exegete, one who is not yet adopted that position, because a lot of modern Catholic exegetes adopt the modern position. You find that they already know that this is the Word of God, for example. They don't say, well, how do we know that this is the Word of God? Can we trust this as being the Word of God? Can we, if we study this book from cover to cover, can we discover that in the book it is the Word of God? They say, well, I know this is the Word of God. From the minute I start reading it, from the very first line, I know this is the Word of God. Well, how do they know that? Well, they didn't know it. They didn't learn it from reading the book. They already know it. Do I know that this is the voice of the Holy Spirit here in every word? They say, well, yes, I already know that. That's a matter of...
Should I bring that with me to the book?
With me to the book.
This skepticism, this critical attitude, I think we can put a great deal of it, of the blame, on the Protestants. That is, Luther, well, I guess he was the one who started it. The Bible and nothing but the Bible. That is, I'm going to rest my faith on the Bible. And that, in a way, puts the Bible on trial. That is, if my faith comes from the Bible, then by golly, my faith has to be proved by the Bible. And right away, you begin to attack it. All right, why should I believe this?
Then you say, well, if there are proofs, let me see these proofs. And then the exegete's job, the commentator's job, is to show you the proofs. They call them, and they had a term, they called them proof texts. That's what the Bible is a kind of battery of proof texts.
Hyphenated proof text. That's one word.
And you read the Bible in such a way as to learn those proof texts. If you hear any Protestant preacher, you hear them around on the university campus all the time. Often quite young people, and they have a prodigious knowledge of the Bible. And they're very good. They have an enormous facility of expression, I must say, and sometimes quite colorful as well. They've somehow been trained, and they're quite good, and they're very convinced too. They're very earnest. But what they know of the Bible are proof texts. If you raise a question, any question at all about the Bible, I mean about God, or anything having to do with religion, that is, if you say, well, how do you know that it's evil to abort babies? They'll say, well, it's right in Genesis, and they'll say it's in chapter 4, verse 3, and it's in St. Paul, chapter 3, the First Corinthians. They'll go right through it, and then they will quote you word for word those texts, and they'll say, therefore, that is proved that those are bad doctrines. And so you can read the Bible that way. But then, of course, you're going to find that a lot of the passages don't prove anything. In fact, you're going to find that very few of them don't prove anything at all. You say, well, what do these things prove that you read in the Bible, in the book of Genesis?
It didn't rain. What are you going to make of that?
You say, well, it proves that God made everything. Well, yeah, you say, but there's so much there. If that's all there were to it, it's you don't need all the rest of that story in there. You can prove that man is a fallen creature, but there's so much more there than that.
Yeah, maybe we ought to go back to that phrase, everything that is written, as St. Paul says, is written for our doctrine. They have a very narrow definition of the word doctrine, I think. Yeah. And that is the idea of proof text derives from a narrow definition of doctrine. Doctrine turns out to be, again, the constitution of our church. That is, this is what we believe. We have a specific confession. We have the Augsburg Confession, or we have whatever it is, the Westminster Creed, and the Bible is written to prove the truth of our doctrine, and everything else is irrelevant. We look only for those things. Whereas the word doctrine, again, just simply means teaching.
It means education or teaching. Doctrine is docta. It's a person who is docta has wisdom, has knowledge. and doctrine is.
We're proposing here a way of reading which is contrary to two things, to the whole scientific temper and to the Protestant temper. And we have to say, within the Catholic Church today, those two forces are very strong. They're very much influenced. I don't mean to say that the modern Catholic exegete is a Protestant. I don't want to get into making accusations of heresy. I'm not talking about that. But what I mean is he brings to the book the same attitude. He's trying sometimes to refute the Protestant. But what he does is he makes that terrible mistake of moving over onto his ground, saying, all right, I'll take your point of view and beat you at your own game. But in doing that, he ceases to read the book the way it was meant to be read.
Yeah, well, that has a history too.
Yeah. I think even the Jesuits are responsible for this as far back as the Reformation.
It really started in the Reformation, that is or what people sometimes call the Counter-Reformation. That is where people decided they had to beat Luther and the Lutherans and the Calvinists and the Baptists and everybody else on their own ground. They had to approach the Bible in this new spirit because everybody was doing it. And that new spirit is a modern critical spirit. That is, all texts were approached that way. All that is the Bible and everything else was now approached in this new way. And so that it's become rather acceptable. And in recent years, it's become more than acceptable. It's become almost the only known way of dealing with the Bible. That is, I often feel that modern scholars, at least a good many modern scholars of the Bible, don't know any other way of going about reading the Bible. This is what they learned somewhere in seminary, really, and from all the books that you read, you would rather gather that this is the only possible way to approach the Bible.
The other way is simply to read the book. Simply. To read the book simply. Simply to read the book. Put the sentence both ways and you get two slightly different meanings. That is to approach it from a very simple, childlike point of view, with your finger under every word, that is, and so it came to pass that, to notice those things, and not to worry, having noticed, not to worry about satisfying your desire. We do keep coming back to this word wonder, largely your fault, because you've made it a life study. But you've often made the distinction, I mean, again, in the whole Western tradition, the distinction is made between wonder and curiosity. Wouldn't one of the distinctions between those two be that wonder doesn't really look to satisfaction? That is, curiosity wants gratification. That is, I'm curious, I want to know what that is, and so you investigate, you turn it over, you look underneath it. Whereas wonder has about it that hesitation to touch it.
Yeah, there's always in wonder at its most fully realized, because wonder is like all other emotions. It isn't always as well realized as it might be, and it's often mistaken for other things. But in wonder, there's always an element of reverence for the object. You realize when you have that emotion of wonder that there's something there that you do not understand. Right away, you see there's something really there beyond you. You know, curiosity is
more like an itch. It's more like
it's an itch. It's an itch. I've often used that very figure. It's an itch for an answer. That is, the thing is that when you approach things with curiosity, you assume that there is an answer there. I was thinking just yesterday. You know, people talk about the stars being 1 billion billion light years away. And people say, now that's an example. If you think of the stars as being a billion light years away, you feel wonder. And I thought to myself, well, that really isn't true. You say, well, I know what a light year is, and I know what a billion is. I don't necessarily, I imagine it exactly, but I know what those are. They're numbers. They're numbers by which you measure things. So if somebody says, and if they're right, and I'm not sure they are, that something is so many billion light years away, I say, well, all right, I know how far away it is now, and that's a long way, but after all, it's just a distance. And if you could measure,
even calculate it.
Yeah, if you could measure a thing, well, and if that's what you're interested in, well, then you know how far away it is. It isn't an infinite distance away. It's some definite distance away, and you can measure that. And if they haven't measured it yet, they may be able to. And those things don't arouse wonder; they arouse curiosity. You say, well, we say I wonder, but we're not really wondering. We don't feel the emotion. We want to know. We want that gratification. How far away is that? How far is it from here to Philadelphia anyway? You know, how many miles? I don't know. How long does it take you to get from here to there?
You look it up in the information almanac.
Yeah, and then you get the answer. You know,
it says, well,
it's this many miles, and if you drove 60 miles an hour, you know, without stopping, you get there in so many hours. You'd say, that's fine. Now I know the answer. But with the questions that arise in your mind when you read the Bible, they are always those kinds of questions, properly speaking. That is, the kinds of questions that the book naturally gives rise to are those questions where you have a reverence for a kind of reverential fear that you have of the book itself, and of the author of the book, which makes you realize that you're talking about something that is beyond what you are going to be able to grasp at all. You feel yourself in the presence of God, really, when you pick up this book.
You know, I was talking the other day about love, which is a similar subject to wonder, and noted something very obvious that we've all noted, I'm sure, in our lives, that the most exciting moment at the wedding feast is the cutting of the cake, but not the eating of it. That is the moment that everyone photographs. They snap the picture of the bride and the groom holding their hands together and cutting the cake. But when you eat it, well, it's cake. You know,
it's usually not as good as most cakes.
It's catered cake, you know,
cake.
And it really is all like that. But that moment before, and the love itself is like that. That is, love itself is the moment before. There is always something unsatisfied in love. Something, we talk about fruits, like the fruits of the Holy Spirit, but those fruits always increase the desire rather than satisfy.
The word desiderium. This was called to my attention. I was reading something again just yesterday. Somebody pointed out that if you look that book up in the dictionary of St. Thomas Aquinas, you'll discover the first primary meaning of that word is something that you don't possess. That's what it means.
It's the opposite of a fruit.
Yeah, it's something you don't have. And so that a desire, in the proper and restricted and narrow sense, and we say the proper and fundamental sense of the word, is always of something that you don't have, that you don't possess.
Now,
want to possess.
In the next life, we have something that in this life that we don't understand. That is, we talk about love in this life is always a sign. The greatest love there is in this life, married love, for example, or the love of a nun who has dedicated her soul to Christ. In the mystical life, it's still desire. As long as we live on this earth, it will always be a sign of that love which we will experience in the next life. But here on earth, it's impossible to do any more than this. And to come back to our subject of how to read, what we're saying is when you read the Bible, you must be a man of desire, like Daniel.
Daniel, yes.
He's a man of desire. He knew how to read the book. He's associated with fire. Not a man of curiosity, because a man of curiosity is not a man of desire. He's a man of satisfaction. There was a terrible hit rock and roll song. You remember that one? The kids used to play it and drive me out of the house. I think an evil song. Can't get no satisfaction. It was the Rolling Stones. It was one of the ones that made the Rolling Stones as famous as the Beatles back in, when was that? 60s or the 70s? I've lost count. 60s. But that was one of the revolutionary songs. And those things are cultural moments. Can't get no satisfaction. I think that's all. I think that was the entire lyric of the song, just over and over again with a lot of rhythm and beating on drums and so forth. But that's curiosity. I want instant satisfaction. But wonder is more akin to love. That is, by definition, it is not going to be satisfied. As a matter of fact, doesn't Shakespeare has some famous lines about it. It increases by what it feeds on now.
Yeah, love. That's love. It increases by what it feeds on. Or that. No, I'm sorry. That's something else. That's hate. That's jealousy.
Jealousy.
That's jealousy. That's,
oh boy,
yeah.
I made a slip there. Although I think that again, jealousy is a desire.
Well, actually, this works in reverse. That is, evil is the same way. It's insatiable.
Yes, but it is insatiable.
Yeah. It doesn't. You can't satisfy your hatred.
Your hatred either. No. It's an inverted. It's an inverted love. But it is true that the more you eat of the fruit of love, the more you desire. It increases your desire. It's like salted peanuts. It doesn't satisfy you. You don't say, "Oh well, poof, now I've loved. Now I've had that. Now I can go to something else. Now I can turn to something else." Whereas with curiosity, once you discover how many billion light years it is to Arcturus, that's that.
You lose your interest in the subject altogether, and the whole world encourages us to think that is what reality is made up of, is problems. Sometimes the word is used to describe this, that it's a problem, and that the whole world is made up of problems. People talk about their marriages as they have problems in their marriage, and so you go to a counselor and he explains to you how to solve your problems. It doesn't work, of course, but
you have an encounter, which is kind of debate.
The idea is that somehow, if you only could solve your problems, then everything would be all right. But there are things that are not problems. Now, there are things that are problems, and we try to solve them. Our income tax is a problem, and our house payments are a problem, and we have all kinds of problems. And there is, and we try to reach solutions to those problems. But it
would be wrong to treat those as wonders.
No.
People sometimes make the opposite error, and they try to do that. I know they'll talk about the magic wonder of accounting and so forth. That's
electronics. We say, the wonders of electronics. You can photocopy things now. Isn't that wonderful? And you say, well, no, it's a solution to a problem. It's handy. Notice that all of those things usually they have to do with means to ends. It's as if love is a means to an end. When you think of it as a problem. But there are means, and we use means to reach ends, and we can work out all the problems with means, but it won't guarantee that we reach the end. And if it is an end, which is what the philosophers would call a high end, an end which is excellent, that is, it excels what we can really realize in this life, then it is going to be beyond us.
We find the same thing in poetry as we do here in the Bible. How often, if you come into a class and you pass out a poem, and you say, well, this is a course in poetry, introduction to poetry, or it may be romantic poetry or 17th century poetry, whatever the subject is, and you come into class and you say, well, let's read this. The students right away want to know the meaning of the poem. And you always suspend that. You say, well, don't worry about that. Let's just read it. Let's just read it. But they have this curiosity to translate the thing into something where they can nod their heads and say, oh, that's what it means. Now, if you could do that, it wouldn't be a poem. It would be a problem. That's what you do in arithmetic when it says if you drive from 30 miles and your car gets 15 miles to a gallon and it costs 89 cents a gallon for gasoline, how much does it cost? And when you solve that, you solve for X. And sometimes it gets very complicated. You solve for X and Y. And that's that. But that's not what you do when you read a line like, so the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the furniture of them. And I know students who would stop and say, well, why does he say furniture? And you think at first, well, that's a good student. He wants to know why. But no, that's not a good student. He wants that translated.
Yeah.
Oh, well, furniture means, what is it?
Start with the actual experience of the thing itself and read it. And then, when you've done that, then they say, well, what do you do then? Well, then you say you read it again. Or you listen to it again, then you recite it aloud after you learn it. And then probably be a good thing if you committed it to memory after you've done that. In other words, all you're doing in all of those activities is simply coming to know the immediate thing itself, which is where all knowledge starts. No matter how high the knowledge is, it all starts for us with that first knowledge of just acquaintance, we say. It's nothing more than that. It's like meeting somebody for the first time. You say, you learn their name, and you notice the color of their eyes and how tall they are, and whether they're overweight or not, and you ask them what they do for a living, and you say, where do you come from, and how long have you lived here? You learn we say those are superficial things, but then all of you don't gaze into their eyes and say, well, what do you think about nominalism? You start at the beginning with all kinds of knowledge.
There is something in us that resists this. We do have an instinct for safety, I suppose. It probably has to do with that mysterious, to me anyway, faculty known as the estimative sense, where it's not the intelligence that works, it's a kind of sense of danger. When we describe this kind of reading, I always remember looking out over a class and seeing the students, watching them as they listen to us say this. You very frequently will see an expression, most frequently I think with the girls, and quite rightly, that is, I think it's a sense they have of, well, I'm not so sure I'm going to do this. When you were a teenager and you took your girlfriend to the carnival, and you went up to the roller coaster, and you said, well, come on, let's go. And she would say, well, I'm not so sure I'm going to get on that thing, She had a sense that there was a danger there. Now, the boys, I'll get on that thing, I want to show off. But, she would hold back. And I think there is a good sense there that, yes, you remember Plato brings this up all the way back now. Go back in your memory to the Republic, where he criticizes the poets, remember? And he says poetry is dangerous. That is, you are taking a chance. If you don't use your critical sense, if you don't say, no, wait a minute, Is this a good poem or a bad poem? Is this a romantic poem? I don't like romantic. I don't want to read. I was told that romantic poetry is very bad, so I'm not going to read if this is romantic. I want to know first whether this is a safe poem for me to read. Is this a Catholic
This
poem?
is a good Catholic poem.
Yeah. We want to be sure. Well, you remember Plato said there is a risk in poetry, and Plato was worried about it because it is dangerous, and you can give your heart. Because this is what we're talking about, really. We're saying, memorize it, take it into your heart. That's a very dangerous thing to do. When you meet a stranger, I don't know, maybe you better not talk to the stranger in the first place. There's a danger in talking to strangers.
That's really one of the reasons that you have introductions.
Yeah.
You say,
This is
somebody you know says, I want to introduce you to somebody, and you know this other person, and you take it for granted that they wouldn't introduce you to somebody who's bad. They give you their word in a way that this is a person that you ought to know. And and I suppose in history, if you had to take the one book in the whole world which has proved to be the most dangerous, it's the Bible. More people have come to wreck reading the Bible, I think, than not reading it. Certainly, all the heresies come out of the Bible. That's another question, really, and it's an important question. That is as to whether people ought to read it at all.
The church has always been very reluctant, rather platonic about this. That is, it treats the Bible pretty much the way Plato treats Homer. That is, the Bible has been censored very, very severely, controlled. The reading of the Bible has been very carefully controlled by the Catholic Church. It has not been given to the people indiscriminately, just to say, oh, go ahead and give your heart to it, because you could misinterpret it. The Church has always taken the position that the Bible needs an interpreter, needs an introduction, if you will. That is, a preacher who says, no, let's take a look at Genesis here. And then you're taken through it safely, because there is a grave danger in misinterpretations, misunderstanding. So, yes.
Well, that's why we're saying that we're, of course, taking for granted here a certain audience, but we're still saying, even for that audience, that the best way to start reading the Bible is not to ask questions.
Don't get into arguments about it.
And get into arguments about it. You just read it. You read it as in a certain way. You read it as you would read any other book. You read it with that reverence that we've talked about. But on the other hand, to the extent that we're assuming this as a book that you don't already know very thoroughly, and perhaps some of our listeners already do know it quite well.
Well, almost nobody does.
But almost nobody does, even though they may have read it.
That's law. That's again, once upon a time in Christendom, well, everybody knew the Bible, from the illiterate peasant to the learned theologian. Everybody knew the Bible. I mean, they astonish you by how much they know. You take up a book like Poetry of Geoffrey Chaucer, where you get to coin a phrase, a cross-section of society. That is, Chaucer has what he calls sundry folk. They're just all together. There are dumb ones and smart ones and good ones and bad ones. But they all know that Bible. That is the references that are dropped back and forth by everybody about everything. We have to go to the footnotes. We don't know who all those people are.
Yes, someone like the wife of Bath, for example, who's not some of the people on the pilgrimage are well educated. The wife of Bath is not well educated. She's we call her kind of a bourgeois character. Probably has a very, very limited education. She's probably illiterate, as are most of the pilgrims on this pilgrimage. Probably can't read and write at all, many of them. But she shows an astonishing
quote St. Paul and
yes, and of other authors as well.
Oh yeah, the Old Testament, the New Testament. Yeah. They make references to what we would consider to be very obscure points. in the Bible. That is, they knew it because the whole culture was drenched in it, from preaching day after day after day, from pictures, from stained glass windows, frescoes on the walls of churches, and just, again, ordinary conversation. It was as common to them as science is to us. I suppose today, if you sat on a Greyhound bus, which would be sort of the equivalent, alas, today, of going on a pilgrimage. I say a Greyhound bus. I always forget that many of the people listening to this tape are not Americans. They'll wonder what we mean by that. But just a bus that transports you from one city to the other. If you go second class, that is, I think the point about the bus is that it's not first class, where you just meet the ordinary people of the nation. Today, you could strike up a conversation about light years, and everybody would know more or less what you meant. That is in an amateur way. I don't mean that they're scientists, but they have the jargon of it. They know what computers are, and they know what. Alas, I'm not very much up on these things because I don't follow it too much. But the average person today is pretty much up on science
and technology. Everybody knows about the new inventions, that have come along. And say, well, do you have a VCR?
Yeah.
And you'd use a VCR, and everybody they'd know immediately what you meant by a VCR. That wouldn't sound strange to them at all. And yet that's a rather sophisticated piece of knowledge.
But the wife of Bath will talk about Phineas out of the Old Testament, and just as familiarly as we would talk about VCRs. It's a different culture. It's a totally different culture.
So when we look at the stained glass windows in cathedrals, we have to have a guide to tell us what those pictures are about. Because sometimes they're not about a lot of them are about very, very famous things, but a lot of times they're not. Or those sculptures on the cathedrals, you look at them and say, well, who is that? And there's some symbol there.
The 24 patriarchs.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. I know Moses. I know what 24 of them, or even the 12 tribes of Israel. Who can name them?
Yeah.
And they say, well, the 12 apostles are coordinated with our realizations of the 12 tribes, and you can't get a group of people to name the 12 apostles. Or for that matter, the 10 Commandments. I remember I was even on that the other day, and I couldn't get a group of students, quite seriously, a group of college graduates, and very bright and Catholics, good, serious people. Within this little group of people, we couldn't get through the 10 Commandments.
Well, that's of course what we mean by knowledge too. I think people
loss of memory.
Yeah, people have the idea that, well, you don't need to know those things. That's not necessary. We have a book here, and anytime we want to know anything about the Bible, we look it up. It's not like it's a book you can carry around with you. I mean, you can you've always got it somewhere. All you have to do is walk into a library, and you have it in your home and your office or wherever you are. And if there's something you want to know, you can go look it up. You don't need to know it. That's another one of those fallacies of modern reading. That is that when you read something, you don't have to retain it. You read it, and then you say, well, I've read the Bible now. I've read the Bible, and I know it. And you say to them, well, who were the 12 tribes of Israel? And they say, well, now really, I don't need to know a thing like that. I'll tell you, I can look there. I know right where that is. I know where that is in the Bible. I can look it up, and I can read off those to you. Why should I bother?
Students get very mad when you give that kind of test.
Yeah,
they say, oh, that's just childish high school stuff. We want a serious essay question.
We want to know the meaning. We want to talk about the meaning of the Bible. And if you say to them, of course, which is what you have to say, you say, well, you're not ready to consider the meaning. You don't know the book. How can you know the meaning of it if you don't know the book first? But they're a little bit like, there's that famous phrase in Alice in Wonderland. They say, well, never mind the evidence, let's have the verdict. Let's skip the evidence, let's have the verdict. Now we want the sentence. Well,
that's curiosity, isn't it? Again, we want the verdict.
To jump over all of that unnecessary stuff in other words, someone who would sit down. People, Mr. Nellick always used to joke about this. He'd say, people come up to you, you'll talk about. He used to teach Milton all the time. And he'd get students really intensely interested in the poem, and a student would come up early in the semester and he'd say, Professor Nellick, could you give me a good book on God? I'd like to. I don't know anything about that subject, and I would really like and see that Milton knows all about it. I really, and you know all about it, but I don't know anything about it. Could you give me a good book on God? Now, obviously, the answer, the answer that comes to mind is, well, the Bible. But that isn't really what they want. If you said that, they'd say, well, no, really. I mean, they'd, of course, say, oh, well, yeah, sure, I see what you mean. But the thing is, that isn't the answer they want. They want a nice book that divides up God into various chapters where you talk about all of the issues having to do with God.
Well, they're also
they're they're all over the place.
I think
they're the Cliff Notes of the Bible, and you say, well, that way you don't have to read the Bible. See, it isn't necessary. They're just like all of the books on Plato or Aristotle. You say, well, I want a good book on Aristotle. And you say, well, there's the complete works of Aristotle. You can go read that. And they say, no, I don't want to read that. That's too hard, and it'd take too much time. What I want is a nice book on the subject that gives you all the answers, really, gives you all the conclusions.
And of course, then you don't have to read the book.
No, it's unnecessary to read the book.
And
really, that's that's so often what the footnotes give you. I know. I happen to have in front of me an edition of the King James Bible. And even in that, I'd say about a third of the page is footnotes. And the Jerusalem Bible, which is very popular right now, that's about half the page is footnotes.
Just again now, is this curiosity? what does the King James do with those chapter headings? Do they have now and so?
Oh no, none of those. You get a word like No, you don't get those words explained at all. What you get are things, they select out things like serpent.
No, but I meant in the King James translation.
Same words. Now and
same words exactly. There's no. I was going to say it's a pretty good translation.
Thus instead of so.
Because in the modern translations, even those words are dropped.
Oh yes. Yeah.
They'll say, well, we'll modernize the language.
You get often I don't know exactly how the Jerusalem Bible goes. I don't own a copy. I think it's often the very beginning is translated when God began to create the heaven and the earth instead of in the beginning.
Changes
and I don't know about the other chapter headings, but the beginnings.
Frequently, you get the old language not really translated, but rewritten. Mm-hmm. For modern readers, that's what it amounts to. Put into modern scientific language. Oh, gee, it's terrible. We were talking just a minute ago about giving your heart to a text, saying, well, I'm going to memorize this, or at least I'm going to read it with a kind of reverence. There's a good analogy of this, and we see the same attitudes operating. And we've talked about this before. God wrote a number of books. He gave a number of revelations. One of them is the Bible. Another one is the world. That is, the creation itself may be thought of, by analogy, as a kind of a book. As God created the sky and the earth and the trees and the stars, and every single thing he created is like a word. That is, it's a thing, but it's also a sign. It has a significance. And we may say, not only is everything that is written in this book for our doctrine, but we may say that everything that is created is for our doctrine. There's a third book he wrote, which we call the Book of History, which has to do with the events in human lives, which are also significant. That is, when you study the life of Julius Caesar, you're studying Julius Caesar, who was a man and who lived, but he's also significant. That is, God is trying to tell us something. He's teaching us through the life of Julius Caesar, or through the events of the Battle of Marathon, and in history. So we can say God wrote 3 books. He wrote the Bible, he wrote nature, and he wrote history. And we ought to learn to read them in the same way. That is, when we talk about how to read, we're talking about something even wider than how to read. We're talking about how to read the world, how to read nature. That is, you should bring this attitude toward science, for example. And we just study nature. And I was thinking as we were talking about that sense that we have of danger, that same sense prevails with the world. That is, how often the moralist will say, "Oh, no, you don't want to look at the sky. You don't want to look at the stars. That will excite your concupiscence. That will excite your desires." And
don't look at the moon. Don't go out on a moonlight night, especially with a girl.
With a girl. There's a certain danger. And again, yes, we would say that's right. The world's dangerous. We come back to this again and again. God has built risk into his creation. He made us free. That's really what it comes down to. The danger is there right from the first pages of the book of Genesis, isn't it? That the possibility that this is all going to go wrong. God did not make it safe.
He made it good. The world is good. All of the creation is good, but it isn't. But we can still err about it. We can see it wrong, and there is something in it that can direct us in the wrong way. There's something that's got into it, not something that God created in it.
But what I mean is, though, that chance is built into it right from the start.
Yeah.
Right from the start. He created man in his own image and likeness, and the commentators will all say, well. That image has to do with rationality, and the likeness has to do with grace. That's usually the way they explain it. And we're like God in the sense that we have intelligence and we have will, and we can undo what he gave us the power to undo it. Boy, what a chance he took when he created us.
Well, we're creatures. That's the thing. We're creatures. Everything is a creature. So that means, of course, that it isn't the creator. It's less than God, but that in all of the creation there is man, a human race that does have this freedom, which is godlike too. It is godlike. That is, the animals and the plants and the minerals and everything else doesn't have that gift of freedom to love God or not to love God. So that that risk is there from the very fact that we are creatures. We're not. If people raise this question, they say, "Well, why did he do that? Why didn't
he make it safe?"
Yeah, why did he make it safe? And you say, "Well, then you'd be God. Maybe you have the idea that he'd just create other gods that'll be exactly like him."
The Trinity is safe.
That's impossible. That's impossible. You couldn't do that.
Well, that's pantheism. Then there is a religion which really sort of believes that God didn't create. That is, that he emanated. That is, that the whole universe is somehow nothing but himself. And you get a lot of that in Teilhard de Chardin and some of these modern theologians who reinvented those old ideas. There is a risk in reading the Bible. There's a risk in reading the book of the world, well, we've raised it. Let's repeat it. What we've been talking about for the last 5 minutes is not a problem. There isn't any solution to it. Because I think sometimes when we talk this way, the student gets the idea that now we're going to come up with a definitive solution to the problem. There isn't any solution to the problem. It's dangerous. What we're saying is you have to take a chance. And it may be that if you start to read the Bible, that you will become a heretic. That is, you will begin to read it and you'll see things in it that the church doesn't teach. And if you had played it safe and never read the book in the first place, you never would have got yourself into trouble. That may be true. And it's true also of the physical world. That is, if you start to love the stars, and as you pointed out, the moon is much worse. The moon is the really dangerous one. You'll become a witch. We've just been through the season of Halloween. I mean, there are witches, isn't the question. There are people who are in love with the moon, and it's a very, very tempting thing to go out. Don't you feel it in the air during this season? My wife and I were talking about that just the other night. You know, the nights are very spooky during these weeks. I mean, it's in the universe. There's some kind of thing there that we don't understand, and there are people who fall in love with the moon, and they are ruined. And we don't have any answer to that. There's no way that you can throw yourself out into the book of nature without running the risk of falling. However, what we're proposing is that's what you have to do, because the chance of winning is the love of God. And if you don't do that, you're never going to read his book. You're never going to know him. You're not going to exercise your freedom. If you're not a man of desire, you're never going to get to the kingdom of heaven.
Because you have to choose, which means that's the exercise of freedom. But if you have the power to choose God, then you also have the power not to choose God. Even the angels, originally, that is, they had this choice. Most theologians say that the angels made the choice at the moment of their creation, but they made their choice. They could have chosen, and many did choose. That is,
I've seen so many good, pious Catholic families like this. Frequently, I hope this isn't offensive. I'm not going to name names, but I think we've all had the experience of priests whose mothers told them to be priests. You know, in a sense, that is, they never made the choice. Their whole lives were controlled by the safety of Mama knows best. I'll just do what my mama tells me, and as long as I stick to that, I don't know how many times I've had this happen in conversations with priests. You'll ask a question, and it'll be some sort of very serious question, which means a very simple one, and they'll say, "Well, I always go back. My mother said." And you stop and think, well, yes, that's good. I mean, we all want mothers, and we all want good mothers, but you wonder whether they ever grew up, whether they ever read the book themselves, whether they aren't just continuously following orders, as if you could be trained into the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, as if there's a kind of method or a kind of track you could get on to that will just take you there automatically.
I think such priests frequently have nervous breakdowns in midlife because they go beyond. Their mothers die, if you will. They're finally put out on their own, and they have to face questions that they've never faced. I don't know. I don't mean to pick on priests. Good Lord, the faithful are this way too. That is, it has been all over the place, especially in the conservative Catholic Church, and the Vatican Council has introduced a lot of revolt against that. And again, I think there's a lot of misinterpretation of the Vatican Council, and it led to some of the worst disasters in the history of the Church. But you do have to say that certainly, even as you do with the Protestant revolt back in the 15th century, 16th century, what they were revolting against was something bad. That is, that safe church, that trained mama says church was wrong. And it's true that in revolting against it, people have gone to opposite excess, which is just outrageous.
They don't care what Mama or
right.
says.
And that's wrong too. That's worse. That's worse. That's worse. No, that's worse. Much worse.
But the other is not a virtue.
But there was something true about the criticism. That is that the Catholic Church had been a church in which people really were forbidden to think. The dangers were exaggerated to the point where the people weren't allowed to face anything at all. All of this is a hard question, I think, very hard question. But it's right here in the Bible. I know that in the Catholic world of the last few hundred years, the Bible has not been read. The Protestants have made that charge, and it's true. That is, the faithful have in a way been forbidden to read the Bible. It hasn't really even been available in a way that it has to Protestants. And the reason was fear. That is, the reason was well-founded fear.
Yeah,
that is, if you turn them loose on the Bible, they'll all become Protestants. They'll all become theologians, and they'll all start to argue, and pretty soon they'll be holy rollers, or I don't know what they'll be. So the best thing to do is to keep the book away from them. Well, I don't know. I don't want to criticize those old bishops. They were probably right. I feel the same way about drinking in Kansas. You go back 100 years to Carrie Nation, who said, "No saloons. We will not allow saloons." She was probably right. When you look at those cowboys, they were drunk all over the place. And it may be that the only solution was to close the saloons. And it may be that at the time of the Protestant Reformation, the only thing to do was to shut the book. As it was the only thing to do. It was too dangerous. But now, let's say that things are even worse. Maybe it's time to open it up again. But when you open it up, this is the point where we're making. You're opening it up really to something very dangerous. Because it's God Himself. And wow, is God full of risk? Nobody in this book, I've got the word backwards, strike that, let's not put it negatively, put it positively. The people who are called in this book by God, they're all, every one of them, in one way or another, is destroyed. That is a very dangerous thing to be called by God. Look at Daniel. Look what that man of desire. Look what he got into. He got into the fiery furnace. Well, he didn't get into it. He got into the lions. His brothers, his friends, got into the fiery furnace. But everybody called by God is called to tremendous risk. But that's what it is. That's the wonder, and that's the love. Love is dangerous.
Yeah, well, the faith is dangerous. That is, Abraham Abraham is often taken as
the first one called.
The very first one. He is the first one called, and he's often used, spoken of in the New Testament as the model of faith. God comes to him and says, "Leave this land and go where I tell you to go," and he does it. He just does it. What we tend to want to ask is, well, why did he do that? I mean, what made him do that? There isn't any explanation. We said before, the Bible is very doesn't give you any explanations. It leaves you with questions.
If you have curiosity, it's not going to be satisfied.
No, that's it. That's it. And that's one reason I think it gives rise to it used to be called, the Bible used to be called the old commentators on the Bible said, well, the Bible is like that for a reason. It's a stumbling block to those who don't have faith. Those people who ask, now, Abraham, you'd say right away, if Abraham said to God, well, why should I?
I want a contract.
Yeah, you'd say, well, you got the wrong man. I mean, he's not going to work. He is not going to work. He simply says, well, yes, I'll do that. He takes, and it is a terrible risk that he takes. He doesn't know. He doesn't know in the way that we so often want to know things. We say, well, if you ask me to go to this place or that place, I want to know how I'm going to get there, and will my insurance be paid? And what are you going to do with with me after I get there and all those things, but none of that is done here. It's just...
I was making a joke on contract because the Calvinists especially, John Calvin, beginning with Calvin, but today all those who are in the Calvinist movement refer to themselves as covenanters. That is, and they actually say, well, the covenant that God made with Abraham, that's a contract. That's a legal contract that God made. That is an oligarchic interpretation of the Bible, if there ever was one. The covenant that God made with Abraham was a mysterious promise that nobody in the Old Testament understood. That is, until Christ comes in the flesh and says, I am the promise, nobody really knew what that promise was.
Well, it's like all promises, it has something to do with something that we don't have. It's a promise of something that lies in the future in terms of history.
Whereas a contract, you have to know what it is.
Yeah. You know in advance what it is.
It's spelled out.
Yeah. Whereas this is mysterious.
A covenant is the opposite of a contract.
Yeah. It's a mysterious thing. The contract is not mysterious. It's the contrast between is very clear when you use those terms. A contract has to be clear. The lawyers make sure that it is absolutely clear and that both parties know exactly what they're getting into. But a covenant isn't like that at all. It's really a lot closer to a human promise than it is to a covenant where you say, it's much closer to those promises that you make, say, when you get married.
Yeah.
And you say,
again, we talk about a contract in marriage, and again, that's an oligarchic interpretation of it. It's really more of a covenant that we make in marriage. It's a promise.
And you don't know. You say, I promise to love, honor, and obey under every circumstance.
Who? You really don't even know the person.
No.
You really don't.
Hardly at all.
Hardly.
And you...
Sometimes not at all. That is, in ancient days when they had arranged marriages, the bride and groom didn't know each other.
And yet they made those promises. In fact, of course, that's why they do make the promises. They make the promises because they don't know what the future is going to be. They're going to be faithful to the promise no matter what happens. That's what you mean by a promise. Is that you're going to be faithful to it even if circumstances are such.
We want to assign everybody the play, Shakespeare's Shylock.
The Merchant of Venice.
The Merchant of Venice at this moment, because there you really get the brilliant satire on contract. That is, Shylock makes a contract and compare it to the marriage, for richer or poorer. Shylock said, "Oh no! I didn't say that. If your ship goes down and you're poor, you still have to pay me because I have a contract here that says that you have to pay me." It's just the opposite, isn't it, of that?
We call it, in religious terms, we call it legalism. We say, there's no doubt that Shakespeare is thinking of the Jews after the New Testament. That is, they were still holding on to a legalistic interpretation of the Old Testament, which was where everything was a matter of law and obligation.
They were trying to hold God to what they thought was a contract. That's what they were mad about, because Christ didn't fulfill what they thought was the contract, namely that they were going to be the rulers of the world.
Yeah, they were going to get they were going to get satisfaction.
Yeah,
my gosh, right. Here at the end of that.
In fact, doesn't Shylock use that word satisfaction? I think he does.
There's something like that.
He wants the blood. He wants his flesh. He wants the pound of flesh. I don't remember whether he actually uses it. It'd be interesting. Kind of check that out, because it would be a good word to use. I want satisfaction. I want.
Well, certainly very clear in everything that he says. That is.
You're right. I just wondered whether the word appeared. I don't remember it.
I don't either. But it's that legalism, which is a perversion of the Old Testament, of course. The word testament is the same kind of a thing.
And I guess one of the criticisms that the post-Vatican II critics have made of the Tridentine Church is that it was legalistic. And there's some truth in the charge. I think, as I say, it's been exaggerated to the point of damnation on the part of rebellious people. But in every wrong, in every revolution, this is really true in history. The revolution wouldn't succeed at all if it wasn't playing upon some force which is really there. That is, for example, the French Revolution was a very, very bad thing. It was monstrous. Doctrines were introduced into the world which were utterly destructive. But isn't it so that what do they call it? The Ancien Regime was indefensible. That revolution never would have got off the ground if Louis XVI had really been a king. And Marie Antoinette, a great queen. No, I don't believe they should have been executed and so forth. But the revolution derived its force from a great, palpable, and obvious want. And I'm afraid we'd have to say the same thing's true. Those of us today who are looking at disasters in the church, and things have all gone wrong, and we say, how did this happen? And some of us tend to say, well, it was all the fault of the Vatican Council. Well, just as Frenchmen say, it was all the fault of the French Revolution. But we have to say, well, yeah, but that never would have happened if there hadn't been some wrong there, some palpable wrong there. And if we go back, we can see that there was an excessive legality. That you look at those old catechisms. I'm very fond of defending, for example, the old catechisms against the new. I've spent quite a bit of my time, in fact, doing that, saying to parents, if you're going to bring your children up, get an old get the old. We call it in the United States the Baltimore Catechism. In Europe, it's the Catechism of Pius X or Cardinal Gasperi's Catechism. They were all kinds of wonderful books. But when you go back over them, isn't it true that they are excessively legalistic? That is, sins were spelt out where the little child was supposed to go over his conscience, and if it was all measured out. If you committed I guess the famous one is immodesty. They had it down to so many inches of the dress was so many inches below the knee or above the knee, or they had it all worked out into calculated detail. Whereas that's not what modesty is. Modesty is a virtue. It's not avoiding a sin. It's practicing virtue. And in the church of the last couple hundred years, the great and magnificent Jesuit order is largely responsible for this. They introduced a kind of reaction, we call it the Counter-Reformation, a kind of reaction to Protestantism which conceded a great deal of its ground. And you'll find this in the Bible criticism, and you'll find it in the moral life as well. That whole shift, if you go back to St. Thomas and you study the virtues, that is, you study the moral life, it's all predicated upon the virtues. It's put positively. But if you look at the manuals that the Jesuits published, and I mean great and good and saintly Jesuits, they're all based on the Ten Commandments. That is, there is a shift there from the positive to the negative. Instead of developing the virtue, you're avoiding the sin. And as I say, let's not second guess the Jesuits. They were in the midst of an earthquake, in the midst of a disaster, and you do what you have to do.
In the context of their time, you say they were doing the right thing. But then you say once you get started on that, people tend to hold on to it.
That's what I mean.
And don't go beyond it. That is,
we got stuck with that.
The avoidance of evil will prevent you from going to hell. If you just avoid evil, if you spend your life learning how to avoid evil, you won't go to hell. That's true. But you'll never get to heaven on that basis. You have to develop, because you don't have the virtues. If you I know. I said things
I
like,
never told a lie in my life. Well, yeah, but what about the truth?
how about the truth?
Your
Well,
love.
I never beat my wife. Well, yes, but do you love your wife? I mean, that's a different thing. You can refrain from assaulting your neighbor, but it doesn't mean that you love your neighbor at all. It's neutrality.
I've never had an impure thought, but have you ever had a pure thought? That is to say, have you ever had a pure desire? Oh, that's bad. That's bad. Yeah.
No, it's
the word desire itself is looked upon as a sin.
Yeah, it's a kind of Puritanism. In fact, it's a puritanical attitude, and it's the lowest level of the spiritual life. As St. Thomas says, that's where the spiritual life comes. You ought to rid yourself of your sins. That's the beginning. But you can't stop there. In order to develop the virtues, you do have to be free from sin. But the next step is by far the most important step. It's the second step in the spiritual life is to develop the virtues, and that's very difficult. That is, getting rid of the sins is difficult, and developing the virtues is very difficult.
But one of the ways one of the ways to develop the virtues, the only way. Let's put it right there. The only way to develop the virtues is to take a chance. That is, avoiding sin is safe. There you know that you can't go wrong. That is, you're not going to beat your wife, or you're not going to have an impure thought, or you're not going to lie. But now we're going to turn around and love our wife, or we're going to tell the truth. We're going to dedicate our lives to the truth. Right away you can see that there's a terrible danger here, because we're not sure always in every case what the truth is. And we're not sure, even in loving our wives, what the consequence of that is going to be. What does that mean? Love is a mysterious thing. We have to work in the dark. It involves the moon. See, it involves those mysterious things that we're not in control of. Love, we've talked about this so many times. Love is really jumping off a cliff. You don't know what you're doing when you love. You are not in control of yourself when you love.
See, that business about avoiding vice is something that you can gain a kind of control over things by doing that. And it does lie within your control to a large degree to overcome those things. But if you give way, if you throw yourself on grace, well, you don't know where that's going to take you at all. It's out of your ken, out of your knowledge, and out of your power. The Bible is a book that has. It is like poetry, only I'm only using an analogy.
It's only more so.
It's more so. That is, if you give your heart to a poem, it will have an effect on you beyond what you expect it to have and what you can control. But this is far more. It's far more true of the Bible. The Bible is the only book whose words have the power to effect what they convey. That's the doctrine.
That's the formal definition of a